Good afternoon. It's great to be here. My name is Jonathan Podluzhny, and today's lecture is about the thought and legacy of Vladimir Lenin. I taught political science for 10 years at Morehead State University before joining the policy world and now work at a DC-based think tank. I'd like to thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Streamable Learning for organizing today's lecture. It's really great to be back in the classroom. One note to begin with, as questions pop up in the lecture, I would invite you to put them in the chat. For technical reasons, I won't be able to look through the chat until the end of the lecture. So we will get to those questions after about a 30-minute lecture. So please be marking them as we proceed. Now, there are three main objectives for our lecture today. First, I'd like to sketch a little bit about Lenin's historical legacy so that we are all on the same page. Second, I want to explain how he builds on the thought of Karl Marx, the leading communist revolutionary of the 19th century. And third, we want to spend some time discussing why communism is necessarily violent and necessarily anti-religious, and why it would require a complete re-education of man to work. We'll achieve these three things by considering Lenin's own words in the context of his deeds and his historical legacy, both his most important book, The State and Revolution, but we'll also look at some of the memos he sent in the years after the Bolshevik Revolution. I hope that's what makes this lecture distinctive. You aren't learning from me, you're learning from Lenin's own words. I'm just here to give the context. So let's begin with a biography, very brief biography of Lenin. He was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1870, and he lived until 1924. So a relatively short life, just 54 years, but immensely consequential. He was yes, thank you. Please do start the slideshow. He was a Russian communist revolutionary, but he was also one of his party's leading political thinkers. So he wasn't just a politician, he was a philosopher, or at least a deep thinker. A very brief history will have to suffice to set the stage for today's lecture. As you all probably know, 1917 brought two revolutions to Russia. In February of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne following hunger strikes. When the military could not guarantee the protection of a successor from the royal family, a new Tsar, the parliament instead formed a provisional government. Lenin led a second violent revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, to take power for his party in October of the same year, 1917. That's an important point because Russia could have had a socialist government through an election, but instead Lenin led the Bolshevik Revolution and refused to allow parliament to convene in 1918. In the years that followed, he built a one-party communist state. He fell ill a few years later in 1922 and died in 1924, ultimately to be replaced by Joseph Stalin, one of history's most cruel dictators. Sometimes Lenin is portrayed as a kind of good guy, and indeed, he expressed concerns about Joseph Stalin at the very end of his life. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev tried to rehabilitate his image as a kind of good guy foil to Joseph Stalin, whose excessive cruelties had become impossible to conceal. So was Lenin a good guy then? The best Victor Sebastian can say, and he's the author of a relatively new biography of Lenin, is that there's no evidence Lenin relished cruelty. So he notes that unlike Stalin, Hitler, or Mao, Lenin didn't appear to take pleasure from the crimes he ordered. There was no evidence, for example, of his asking for the gruesome details about a political rival's execution. But he was not a good guy. He led a revolution, even though Russian socialists, that is, politicians committed to redistributive reforms to benefit the poor and extend rights to all Russians, even though they would have won the election and held power into the foreseeable future. And he did so knowing that he would likely unleash a civil war. He did so knowing that that civil war would likely lead to the deaths of thousands. By his death, he had built a one-party communist state, including the institutions Stalin would later deploy to such terrible effect. To highlight this point, consider a few elements of Stalin's legacy before we get into his thought. He invites peasants to seize the land, knowing that the nobles and the kulaks, that is, the wealthy peasant farmers, the wealthier peasant farmers, would fight back. He invites workers to seize factories, which led to the deaths of many factory owners and even some factory managers, not to mention it led to a terrible economic contraction. He used what we would call terror tactics today to organize the Red Army for civil war, threatening to kill the farmers or officers who defected to fight with the White Army. He created the Cheka, the secret police that would later become the KGB. He established tight ideological control of his party, allowing no dissent, no deliberation about policy. He established concentration camps to hold political prisoners and called them concentration camps. He began the practice of seizing grain from the countryside, which created a terrible famine in 1921 and 22 that killed about 250,000. And he used the famine to weaken the church. He seized and redistributed private homes, and he seized the banks, creating havoc in the economy. So without a doubt, Lenin was a through and through radical, a Marxist revolutionary. We're going to spend our time today looking at his last major work, The State and Revolution, with references to his political legacy. I think that we'll learn a few things that were underdeveloped in Marx, right? The dominant communist thinker. Lenin will explain why the communist project requires revolution and violence, right? He'll explain what Lenin means, or what Marx meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat. We'll learn from Lenin the difference between socialism and communism. We'll also learn the ways in which communism is incompatible with human nature as it is today. That's something Lenin spells out. And we'll learn why achieving communism, where everyone is equal and satisfied with their lot, is probably not ultimately possible. Understanding Leninism today is important for several reasons. Communism was by far the most destructive political force of the 20th century. Its death toll stands upwards of 94 million people. The most vicious communist regimes committed some of the 20th century's greatest crimes. For example, it is believed that 2.5 to 3 million people died in Stalin's Kolyma death camp alone, labor camp alone. In 1932 and 1933, Stalin responded to Ukrainian resistance to collectivizing measures by transporting the country's grain stocks to Russia and sealing Ukraine's borders. That starved perhaps as many as 7 million people to death, all to punish Ukrainians and to dissuade independence movements in the Soviet satellite states. Mao Zedong's experiment with collectivization of agriculture in China was even more destructive, killing between 30 and 40 million people between 1959 and 1961. In the 30 years between the 1950s and the 1980s, approximately 50 million Chinese passed through Mao's forced labor camps. By the 1980s, fully 1/3 of the world's population lived under communist dictatorships, which is to say under conditions of poverty and political oppression. Those living in the world's remaining communist regimes today are among the poorest and brutally oppressed on the planet. Before we jump to Lenin, though, and we're about to do that, I promise, it's important to understand the goals of Marxism. So let's spend 5 minutes on that. Karl Marx, a brilliant philosopher and some say a mediocre economist, wrote that, oh, thank you for that slide, wrote that previous philosophers had only interpreted the world. The point, instead, is to change it. Marx advocated a new kind of government, communism, and we all know the basics, right? Communism is where we abolish private property and the workers seize the farms and industry. Marx imagined a classless society and the end of oppressive government, right? That is indeed the end of all government. The result would be a radically egalitarian society. So we all know that, but why did he want to do this? Why did he think that that would be good for human beings? This point on the slide is often overlooked, right? Above all, Marx's goal is the establishment of a political system dedicated to freedom. For Marx, though, freedom is more than the absence of constraint, right? Freedom from interference. For Marx, freedom meant life in an environment that supports the freedom to. As he explains in an early work, The German Ideology, only in community with others has each individual the means of cultivating his gifts in all directions. Only in the community, therefore, is personal freedom possible. Work with a creative purpose for the sake of something more than enriching others is inherently rewarding, and that's what Marx wanted for everyone. He argues that true freedom requires that human beings have sufficient resources at their disposal to realize that creative potential. This is only possible, however, under supportive political and economic conditions. Slide 3. So what is Marx's vision? As he puts it in his most famous depiction of the end state, the communist state he's working toward, in communist society where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, that is, think after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. For Marx, then, a communist society was to be a society in which the full and free development of every individual forms the ruling principle, right? That's what society should be all about. A society in which the full development of each is the condition for the free development of all, a society that seeks for its members completely unrestricted exercise of their physical and mental faculties. So that sounds nice. Slide 4. For Marx, the problem with capitalism is the division of labor, an innovation that allowed factories and farms to turn out an increasing supply of food and goods. Marx saw work in the great factories of Europe, where conditions were truly terrible, as ruinous for human beings. Completing the same menial task all day, every day, like putting the head on a pin, is a ruinous force. It destroys the human intellect, it saps the human will, and it perverts man's attitude toward fellow men. There's no outlet in a situation like this for man's creative capacities, and the worker becomes estranged from whatever his workplace is supposed to be making. Artisanship ends, and workers are reduced to fleshy machines, paid barely subsistence wages, and ridden their whole lives for the profit of others. In Marx's words, modern industry reduces the worker to a mere fragment of a man. We're alienated from what we produce. Slide 5. Man's own deed, his work, becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. So Marx saw capitalism as enslaving individuals. However, he also understood that capitalism would make communism possible, right? Something Lenin will emphatically agree with. This is because this is important because a society in which everyone has the support they need to achieve their full potential is going to need a lot of stuff. Capitalism produces that stuff and makes it possible for socialism and communist revolutions to come. Now let's turn to Lenin. Next slide, please. Specifically, his most important book, The State and Revolution. He finished this book in the summer of 1917, that is between the two revolutions that we discussed. By looking at Lenin's thought in the context of his actions, we'll come to see what communism really is, what it would necessarily become in practice. At the very beginning of his book, Lenin explains his purpose. He says that his book is designed to restore the true doctrine of Marx on the state. That is, he wants to explain that Marx was fundamentally a revolutionary. He says this because he's fighting for influence among Russian socialists with those who are more moderate, who want, for example, to work through parliamentary institutions. As we'll see, he offers more radical interpretations to suit his purposes, many of which foreshadow the brutality and evil of the Bolshevik era. So the first point that I want to make by looking at what Lenin says is that communism is necessarily violent. He knew the revolution would be violent before it happened. Where Engels and Marx sometimes talked about a state melting away, Lenin says it will take immense violent activity. So here we see a good example of that. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie, right, that is the middle-class workers, can be achieved only by the proletariat, the working class, becoming transformed into the ruling class, capable of crushing the inevitable and desperate resistance of the bourgeois, the wealthier, and of organizing all the toiling and exploited masses for the new economic order. The proletariat needs state power, the centralized organization of force, the organization of violence for the purpose of crushing the resistance of the exploiters and for the purpose of leading the great mass of the population, the peasantry, the petty bourgeois, the semi-proletarians, the working classes, in the work of organizing socialist economy. So here, Lenin is making clear that there will not be a gentle communist revolution. It will require seizing the state and using it to crush the wealthier classes. It's an answer to the social democrat rivals who would have preferred to work through parliamentary institutions. The problem with parliamentary institutions, with democracy, is that elected officials are too easily bought off by the capitalists, right? That's why Lenin says, we need a revolution, we need violence. And we're not talking about violence around the edges here. Lenin makes clear that for socialism to come, the oppressive bourgeoisie as a class must be completely obliterated. So move to slide 7, please. At a certain stage of the development of democracy, Lenin says, it first rallies the proletariat as a revolutionary class against capitalism and gives it the opportunity to crush, to smash to atoms, to wipe off the face of the earth, the bourgeois, even the Republican bourgeois, the state machine, the standing army, the police, and the bureaucracy. So what does this look like in practice? All right, so let's look at slide 8. We see what Lenin orders to deal with the kulaks, that is, wealthier peasant farmies in the countryside. In a 1918 memo, so this is just after the revolution is unleashed, he calls on party members to hang without fail so the public sees at least 100 notorious kulaks, the rich and the bloodsuckers, publish their names, take away all of their grain, execute the hostages. This needs to be accomplished in such a way that people for hundreds of miles will see and tremble. And don't forget, use your toughest people for this. In the cities, the factories were seized by workers encouraged by the Bolshevik Party, with owners and managers killed. And in the ensuing civil war, as many as 10 million were killed. Right? So Lenin goes into the revolution knowing what kind of violence will be required. The second point I want to make is, and this is the next slide, is that communism cannot coexist with strong religious convictions. And so from the beginning, Lenin launched a war on the Orthodox Church. Marx believed religion was bad for human beings. He dismisses religion as the opium of the people, right? A kind of drug that distances ourselves from our real concerns, because he believes that it leads individuals to settle for a, quote, illusory form of happiness, otherworldly satisfactions that are born of and reliant on profound ignorance. It is necessary to undermine religion's claims, quote, so that man will think, act, and fashion his reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses, so that he will move around himself as his own true son. Nikolai Bukharin, a Bolshevik thinker at the time of Lenin, they were friends for part of their lives, complained that religion has been in the past one of the most powerful means at the disposal of the oppressors for the maintenance of inequality, exploitation, and slavish obedience on the part of the toilers. In other words, Soviet officials conceived of the church as nothing better than a landlord on a grand scale, a group of people, of powerful men, who remain wealthy by exploiting the working class with the help of a powerful propaganda instrument, that is religion, that keeps people stupid and ignorant. That's Bukharin's argument. Marxists believe that religious commitments are therefore a problem for communists because religion stalls the march of history. Faith leads workers to put the care of the soul above concern for their pocketbooks. Right? The more religious a working class is, the less likely it is to rise up against its capitalist oppressors. So that's why communist officials closed churches, theological seminaries, and religious organizations. It's why they killed and imprisoned priests and recruited others as collaborators. And it's why they removed religious instruction from the public schools and surveilled religious leaders and harassed religious communities. Lenin used the famine in 1922, right, caused by his own reforms, to take extreme action against the Orthodox Church. So moving to slide 10, writing to top party officials, he explained that the widespread hardship created by famine could be used to weaken the church, the Orthodox Church, while strengthening the party. So this is from a 1922 memo to party leaders. He says, "We must pursue the removal of church property by any means necessary in order to secure for ourselves a fund of several hundred million gold rubles. Without this fund, any government work in general, any economic buildup in particular, is completely unthinkable. In order to get our hands on this fund, we need to do whatever is necessary. But to do this successfully is possible only now." And this is the key point. "All considerations indicate that later on we will fail to do this, for at no other time besides that of desperate famine will give us such a mood among the general mass of the peasants, many of whom are deeply religious, that would ensure them the sympathy toward us, or at least to neutralize them, as we take church property, including consecrated gold items." Right. So essentially, what Lenin is saying is we need to use the famine to weaken the church and enrich the Bolshevik party. Moving on to slide 12. Lenin's move was self-consciously Machiavellian, right? So anyone who knows anything about Machiavelli knows that this is the philosopher who taught statesmen, who taught politicians how to be evil, right? And so Lenin is saying he learned from Machiavelli to do. One clever writer on statecraft correctly said that if it is necessary for the realization of a well-known political goal to perform a series of brutal actions, then it is necessary to do them in the most energetic manner for the shortest time, because masses of people will not tolerate the protracted use of brutality. Therefore, I came to the indisputable conclusion that we must precisely now smash the Black Hundreds clergy most decisively and ruthlessly, and put down all resistance with such brutality that they will not forget it for several decades. And so it wasn't just a matter of using a crisis to seize the wealth of the church. Richard Pipes puts the number of priests executed in 1922 at 1,215, and that includes 28 bishops or church leaders. The Russian Communist Party made anti-religious propaganda a priority in this period, launching magazines dedicated to promoting atheism. The state launched re-education camps for youths where they encouraged atheism and sexual experimentation. Religious publications were banned, right? So they were trying to destroy religious commitment to the extent that they could. Why? Well, the problem with religion and strong faith commitments for any totalitarian regime, any dictatorship, is not simply that they distract men and women from their own oppression and from political enterprise. Religion also creates a zone of privacy, a place for trust and civil association, a place for free thought and worship together. Totalitarian regimes, they have to work to infiltrate churches and buy off priests to ensure that that religious sphere is weak. Otherwise, it will be a place to organize against the dictatorship. The lessons learned in Poland in 1979 have been relearned this century in other places like Iraq and Egypt. Things did not improve under Stalin. And just fast forwarding, under Stalin, churches were regularly dynamited. In the year 1937 and 1938, during Stalin's purges, Church records count 168,000 Orthodox priests arrested and over 100,000 shot, right? And so this is part of the logic of communism, as Lenin explains to us what it will have to be. Moving on to slide 12, please. What about family? The Bolsheviks also sought to undermine the family, right? Some progressive sounding reforms to ensure the legal equality of women, like the establishment of civil marriage, the simplification of divorce, and the abolition of the concept of illegitimate children, as well as the provision of spousal maintenance, were immediately undertaken to encourage the atomization of society. Youth camps were established where Bolshevik leaders encouraged sexual experimentation to unleash eroticism among young people. Bolsheviks also assigned workers to shifts and factories that splintered the family and extended families. Right, so you might have a husband and wife working in different parts of the city and working completely different shifts. So why such an emphasis on breaking down familial ties? Well, what Lenin understood is that family and life in a successful family unit vents revolutionary energy. Right? So if you want young people to be political revolutionaries first and foremost, they can't be connected, deeply connected to family. So he also realized that strengthening the state requires breaking down those bonds. All right, the fourth point I want to make has to do with how this socialist communist state would come to be and its requirement that human nature change. Right, so moving on to slide 13, please. One of the ironies of Leninism is that as much as he hates capitalism, he also knows that capitalism has to come before socialism in order for socialism to succeed. And not just in the sense that capitalism creates a massive industrial base. He also argues that managing the state is simple now. It can be done with less government thanks to advances in human capital. Right, so he says the development of capitalism itself creates the prerequisites that enable all to take part in the administration of the state. Some of these prerequisites are universal literacy, already achieved in the advanced capitalist countries, then the training and disciplining of millions of workers by the huge, complex, and socialized apparatus of the post office, the railways, the big factories, large-scale commerce, banking, etc. With such economic prerequisites, it is quite possible immediately, overnight, after the overthrow of the capitalists and bureaucrats, to supersede them in the control of the production and distribution in the work of keeping accounts of labor and its product by the armed workers, by the whole of the armed population. So what he's saying is wipe out the government, right, the old government, and workers can take control of not just government, but all of industry. Think about how naive that is, right? Slide 14, please. He believes that all citizens can become employees and workers of a single state syndicate. All that is required is that they should work equally to do their proper share of work and get paid equally, right? So Lenin thinks that that is likely to occur in the short term, that folks will just work equally, do their share, and get paid equally. He claims that administration will be simple now. Slide 14. He believes that thanks to capitalism, overnight it can be overnight the administration, the government, and industry can be repurposed to serve entirely different needs, as though the people themselves have no personal interest or passions that might not align with the Bolshevik vision. None of the leading Bolshevik leaders had any real administrative experience in government, and yet it did not stop them from seizing control of the government and nationalizing the economy while driving out all those who had formerly been the people who operated it. That's right, this is the right slide. There is an important tension on the subject of property that should also be explored. Right, the abolition of private property, right, and public ownership of all of the productive capacity doesn't mean that people will no longer need things, and not just food and clothing, but the implements one needs to do one's work. Right, let's say you're a farmer, right? Or a symphony conductor, you still need things. And yet the complexity of matching supply and demand, of producing, acquiring, and distributing is not addressed by Lenin, right? He seems to believe that everything will happen in a very simple way. The means of production are no longer the property of individuals, he says. This means the means of production now belong to the whole society. Every member of society performing a certain part of socially necessary labor receives a certificate from society to the effect that he's done a certain amount of work. According to this certificate, he receives from the public warehouses where articles of consumption are stored a corresponding quantity of products. If Lenin was naively optimistic about the challenges posed by, say, supply chains, he was not a utopian when it came to the need for state power. And here we come to one of his most chilling passages when he explains when the state will finally wither away. So slide 16, please. So he knows that his revolution will not come immediately. He says, we are not utopians. We do not indulge in dreams of dispensing at once with all administration, with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based upon a lack of understanding of the tasks of the proletarian dictatorship, are totally alien to Marxism, and as a matter of fact, serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until human nature has changed. No, we want the socialist revolution with human nature as it is now, with human nature that cannot dispense with subordination, control, and managers. But the subordination must be to the armed vanguard of all the exploited. So what he's saying here, and this is one of the most important passages in Lenin in my mind, is that the Marxist revolution, where everyone gets what they need to survive and to thrive, is only possible if human nature changes such that we're all willing to work and get an equal amount of things. He says, until human nature changes, you're going to need power over people, right, to subordinate them. And that's what Lenin explains the Bolsheviks are up to. So he goes into the revolution knowing that for a long time, an armed vanguard of the proletariat, that is, his party, will be the ones doing the subordination. For how long? Again, it's worth underlining the point in red that you'll need that subordination until human nature changes. Now, this gets us to the difference between socialism and communism, something that is widely misunderstood today. And I promise we're coming to the end of the lecture. Next slide, please. Lenin explains that what is generally called socialism, Marx called the first or lower phase of a communist society. Insofar as the means of production become common property, the word communism is also applicable. But the key point is that the distribution of articles of consumption inevitably presupposes the existence of a state, an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of standards of right. So socialism occurs when the state owns everything, but the state still needs to use power to redistribute. Right? So you've taken everything, and it's now up to a party to decide who gets what, right? Who gets what house, who gets what job. When does communism arrive? Lenin ends the state and revolution by explaining that essentially we'll know it when we see it. Next slide, please. The door will only be opened wide for the transition from the first phase, socialism, to the higher phase, and with it to the complete withering away of the state, when we've all learned the art of administration and will all indeed independently administer social production. So only when we're all willing to work according to our capacity and take only as much as we need, only at that point, when we have changed, will we be able to have a communist society that does not rely upon the subordination by force of others. That is, as he said earlier, when virtually all members are willing to produce according to ability and take according to need without cajoling or supervision. Only when that occurs will we get to the communist paradise. And that gets us to our last slide, right? Where we emphasize that communism requires changing human nature, and that requires a complete re-education. Lenin admits this in many places, right? That in order for his revolution to work, we would need a completely new kind of man. And that is one of the dominant tasks of his party, right? And so again, to change human nature, to create a communist individual, the Bolsheviks understood that it would be that it would be necessary to censor, right, to ensure that you did not have access to ideas that didn't align with the Bolshevik party line, that it would be necessary to weaken family, to weaken nationalism, to take control of the schools, and to completely control the intellectual environment of young people, and again to completely exert a thoroughgoing censorship. By the time Stalin takes over, thousands of public intellectuals and authors are on the censored list. So I'll close by just raising the question, right? Is it possible, right, to get to the kind of communist society that Lenin and Marx imagined? All right, I don't see any questions in the chat. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's lecture. And I'd like to thank Streamable Learning and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for the opportunity to see you all today.